The roar started as a low rumble, quickly escalating into a thunderous wave. It's not of water, but of something thick, dark, and syrupy, rising 15 feet high, hurtling through Boston streets at 35 miles per hour. In mere moments, it buckled steel girders, tore apart buildings, and swept away everything in its path. Imagine the unimaginable. An entire neighborhood drowned in a deadly, sweet tsunami, all on a deceptively warm January afternoon. Welcome, everyone. Today, we're diving deep into one of history's most bizarre and tragically overlooked disasters. The Great Molasses Flood, Boston's deadly wave of syrup. And I promise you, by the end of this tale, you will never think of industrial safety, or even a simple sweet treat the same way again. We unearth incredible, forgotten stories like this every single week. So if you don't want to miss the next one, make sure you're subscribed and join our community of historical explorers. All right, let's step back to January 15th, 1919, the quiet north end of Boston, just moments before the world turned upside down. All right, let's step back to January 15th, 1919, the quiet north end of Boston, just moments before the world turned upside down. Imagine, if you will, a city teetering on the edge of a new era. Boston in 1919 was a fascinating, vibrant tapestry of old-world charm and burgeoning modernity, a place where history clung to cobblestone streets. Even as the hum of industry and the promise of progress reshaped its skyline. The Great War had just ended a few months prior, and the city, like the nation, was exhaling a collective sigh of relief, mingled with a profound sense of exhaustion and uncertainty. The young men who had marched off to distant battlefields were now slowly trickling home, bearing the invisible scars of conflict, stepping back into a world that felt both familiar and irrevocably changed. Their return brought a wave of bittersweet joy, parades, and tearful reunions. But also, the daunting task of reintegrating into a society grappling with its own post-war identity. This wasn't merely a city, it was a living, breathing organism, constantly in flux. Horse-drawn carts still rattled over uneven pavement, competing for space with the growing number of automobiles, their engines a new, exciting roar in the urban symphony. Electric streetlights cast their glow over gas lamps, and the telephone, once a novelty, was rapidly becoming an indispensable tool, off-commerce and connection. Boston was an intellectual powerhouse, its universities drawing minds from across the globe, but it was also a gritty, working-class town. Its prosperity built on the sweat and toil of its diverse population. At its heart, Boston was a port city, and in 1919, its waterfront was the very pulse of its economic lifeblood. Tall-masted schooners, their sails furled, mingled with the more modern, steam-powered cargo ships that had ferried supplies across the Atlantic during the war. The air near the docks was a rich, complex perfume, the salty temps of the sea, the rich aroma of coffee beans spilling from burlap sacks, the sharp scent of timber, and the earthy smell of coal smoke curling from countless chimneys. The rhythmic clang of winches, the shouting of longshoremen in a dozen different languages, the mournful blast of a ship's horn echoing across the harbor. These were the constant soundtracks of Boston's commercial heart. Goods of every conceivable kind flowed in and out of the city, transforming it into a vital hub of trade and industry for the entire New England region. This ceaseless flow of commerce not only fueled the city's economy, but also defined the daily rhythms and the very character of its working-class neighborhoods. And of all these neighborhoods, none was quite as vivid, as densely packed, or as utterly essential to Boston's identity as the North End. This was a place with history etched into every brick, a place that had been a vital part of Boston since its earliest colonial days. By 1919, however, its character had been utterly transformed. It was no longer the exclusive domain of Yankee merchants or revolutionary patriots. Instead, the North End had become the vibrant, beating heart of Boston's Italian-American community. Imagine stepping into this district. The narrow, winding streets, some barely wide enough for two wagons to pass, were a riot of color, sound, and life. Tenement buildings, 5 or 6 stories high, stood shoulder to shoulder, their brick facades softened by time and the clinging tendrils of ivy. Laundry lines, strung precariously between windows, crisscrossed the alleys like intricate spiderwebs. Fluttering with the day's wash, a patchwork flag of domesticity, the sounds were a constant, joyful cacophony. the high-pitched, chatter-off children playing stickball in the street. Their laughter mingling with the melodic rise and fall of Italian dialects spoken from open windows. The booming baritone of a vendor hawking fresh fish, the distant peal of church bells calling the faithful to worship. The air itself was thick with the rich, aromatic tapestry of Italian cooking. The sharp, tangy scent of simmering tomato sauce mingled with the robust fragrance of garlic and oregano. The sweet perfume of baking bread wafted from local bakeries, and the earthy notes of roasting peppers spilled from open doorways. Small, family-owned shops lined every street, a butcher proudly displaying his cuts, a baker offering warm loaves dusted with flour, a grocer's stall overflowing with vibrant fruits and vegetables, each a testament to the bounty of the land and the ingenuity of its people. These were not merely places of commerce, were extensions of home, where news was exchanged, friendships forged, and the sense of community strengthened with every transaction. Life in the North End was lived on the streets, in the piazzas, and within the tightly knit embrace of family and neighborhood. Generations often lived under one roof or in close proximity, fostering a powerful sense of loyalty and mutual support. For many, this was a fresh start, a new chapter written on American soil, but one that held fast to the traditions and heritage of the old country. Immigrants had flocked to Boston's shores, particularly from southern Italy, seeking economic opportunity and an escape from hardship. They brought with them a profound work ethic, a deep cultural pride, and an unshakable determination to build better lives for themselves and their children. This community was, for the most part, a working-class community. Men found employment on the docks, loading and unloading cargo, or in the city's various factories and workshops. Women often worked in garment factories, or took in laundry and sewing, contributing vital income to the household. Children, too, contributed, often running errands, helping in family businesses, or selling newspapers on street corners. It was a life of hard work, but also one imbued with a vibrant social fabric. Lively festivals, boisterous family gatherings, the comforting ritual of Sunday Mass at one of the neighborhood's beautiful churches. These were people who had built their lives, brick by careful brick, in the shadow of American promise, often against considerable odds. They were survivors, dreamers, and the very backbone of Boston's industrious spirit. Yet, beneath this bustling surface, Boston in 1919 was also grappling with deeper currents of change and tension. The devastating Spanish flu pandemic, which had swept across the globe in 1918, had left its indelible mark, taking a heavy toll on the city's population, particularly in densely populated areas like the North End. While the worst of the pandemic had passed by January 1919, a lingering sense of vulnerability and loss still permeated the atmosphere. People had witnessed unimaginable suffering, and the city was still in the slow process of healing, physically and emotionally. The memory of the masks, the empty streets, and the constant tolling of funeral bells was fresh in many minds, adding a layer of subdued solemnity to the otherwise vibrant city. Furthermore, the post-war economic landscape was complex. While some industries boomed, others faced uncertainty. Inflation was a growing concern, eroding the purchasing power of working families. This era was also marked by significant labor unrest across the nation, as workers demanded better wages, safer conditions, and a greater share of the profits they helped create. Though Boston was not immune to these tensions, the immediate aftermath of the war brought a brief lull in major strikes. As the city focused on recovery and the return to normalcy, still, the seeds of future industrial strife were being sown, adding to the sense that this was a pivotal moment in American history, a cusp between an old order and a new, undefined future. And then there was the looming shadow of Prohibition. The Volstead Act, which would usher in a nationwide ban on the production and sale of alcoholic beverages, was just months away from passage. Though the movement towards temperance had been gaining considerable momentum for years, for communities like the North End, where wine with meals and local social clubs were integral to cultural and daily life, the prospect of prohibition was met with a mixture of defiance, apprehension, and even a degree of quiet planning for how to navigate the impending changes. It was another sign that the familiar world was rapidly shifting, pushing against long-held traditions. In the midst of all this, standing tall, and somewhat incongruously amidst the old brick buildings and narrow lanes of the North End, was the massive steel tank belonging to the Purity Distilling Company. It was an industrial behemoth. A colossal cylinder of metal rising approximately 50 feet into the air, with a diameter of about 90 feet. Its dark, imposing silhouette dominated the landscape along Commercial Street, just a stone's throw from the waterfront. To the residents of the North End, particularly those who lived in its immediate vicinity, the tank was simply a part of the everyday scenery. It had been there since 1915, a silent, ever-present sentinel, a testamento, the industrial might of the city. Children playing in the streets might have glanced at its immense form without a second thought. Women hanging laundry might have seen its dark curve against the sky as they went about their chores. Men walking to work in the docks or to the nearby elevated train station would have passed by it, their minds occupied with the day's tasks, not the potential contained within its riveted steel plates. The tank itself was a monument to molasses, surprisingly versatile and valuable commodity in 1919. Molasses, a thick, dark syrup, was a byproduct of sugar refining. But its uses were manifold. It wasn't just for sweetening baked goods or making rum. In industrial quantities like this, it was a crucial ingredient in the production of industrial alcohol, which in turn was used to make everything from munitions and solvents to commercial yeast and even some medicines. With World War I recently concluded, demand for such industrial products had been incredibly high. Companies like Purity Distilling had been working at full capacity to meet those needs. The tank was therefore seen as a symbol of prosperity, of progress, of Boston's role in the global economy. It was a utilitarian structure, undeniably immense, but seemingly benign. It was, after all, just molasses. The Purity Distilling Company had chosen this location for its massive storage tank for practical reasons. Its proximity to the waterfront allowed for easy transfer of molasses directly from ships arriving in Boston Harbor. Pipelines ran from the docks, efficiently pumping the viscous liquid into the giant container. From there, it would later be transferred by railcar to the company's distillery in Cambridge, where it would be processed. It was a well-oiled, efficient system designed for high-volume operation, a testament to the era's engineering ambitions. On that unseasonably warm January morning, the air was mild, almost spring-like, a peculiar warmth from midwinter in Boston. A light rain had fallen overnight, leaving the cobblestones slick and gleaming in the weak morning light. The usual hustle and bustle of the North End was already in full swing. Streetcars clanged their way along the tracks. Children were making their way to school, their satchels swinging, and the pungent aroma of brewing coffee mingled with the ever-present sense of the harbor and the distinctive, like a slightly sweet smell that always seemed to hover around the giant molasses tank. It was a smell that had become so familiar, so much a part of the background, that most residents barely registered it anymore. It was just the smell of their neighborhood, the smell of commerce, the smell of life in the North End. No one looked at that tank with fear or trepidation. It was a fixture, as much a part of the landscape as the steeple of St. Stephen's Church, or the brick tenements themselves. It held a benign, sweet substance, not a volatile chemical, not a dangerous explosive. It was simply a container, a vessel designed to hold the thick, dark liquid that fueled part of Boston's industry. The idea that this inanimate object, this symbol of progress, could unleash unimaginable horror upon their lives, transforming their bustling, vibrant community into a scene of unspeakable devastation was utterly beyond the realm of comprehension. It was a morning like any other, a Tuesday that promised nothing more than the ordinary rhythm of daily life. The residents of the North End went about their business, unaware that beneath the seemingly placid surface of that colossal tank, a silent, deadly pressure was building, poised to shatter their world in a way no one could have ever predicted. The stage was set, the unwitting actors were in place, and the curtain was about to rise on one of the most bizarre and tragic chapters in Boston's storied history. That towering structure, that colossal cylinder dominating the waterfront, was more than just a storage facility. It was a testament to the ambitions of the Purity Distilling Company, and, as we would tragically come to learn, a monument to corporate short-sightedness and negligence. To the casual observer, it was an impressive feat of engineering for its time, standing 50 feet high with a diameter of 90 feet. capable of holding a staggering 2.3 million gallons of molasses. Imagine that volume for a moment. Enough to fill an Olympic-sized swimming pool more than 8 times over.
Ow.
It was a dark, imposing presence, a silent sentinel that had watched over the bustling North End for over 4 years. But beneath that seemingly robust exterior, a dark secret festered. A silent conspiracy of shoddy workmanship and corner-cutting that would ultimately prove fatal. The story of the molasses tank, you see, is not just about its catastrophic failure, but about the insidious additions that led to it. It begins, as so many stories do, with the insatiable demands of industry and the relentless pursuit of profit. The Purity Distilling Company, a subsidiary of the United States Industrial Alcohol Company, WSA, major player in the rapidly expanding industrial alcohol market. This was the era of World War I, and the demand for ethanol, used in everything from munitions and solvents to medicinal supplies, was skyrocketing. Molasses, a byproduct of sugar refining, was the primary raw material for producing this crucial alcohol. To meet this demand, Purity Distilling needed immense storage capacity. A place to hold the vast quantities of thick, dark syrup arriving by tanker ships from the Caribbean, for it could process at their distillery in Cambridge. Their solution was this colossal tank, erected on Commercial Street. Right in the heart of Boston's densely populated North End, the decision to build it was made in haste. Driven by the war emergency and the promise of lucrative contracts, speed, it seemed, was prioritized over safety and cost efficiency over structural integrity. And this, my friends, was the very first crack in the tank's foundation. Long before a single steel plate was riveted into place, the construction of the tank began in 1915, and from the outset, it was a rush job. The company hired a man named Arthur Gill to oversee the project. Now, Mr. Gill was a businessman and executive. But critically, he possessed no formal engineering training or experience in designing or constructing large, complex structures like this. He was tasked with an immense responsibility for which he was entirely unqualified.
That was in essence like asking a baker to design a skyscraper.
His lack of expertise meant that crucial engineering principles were either overlooked, misunderstood, or simply deemed unnecessary in the scramble to get the tank built and operational. The design itself was flawed. While the overall concept of a cylindrical tank for liquid storage was sound, the specifics of its execution were alarmingly deficient. Modern engineering standards would have called for precise calculations of stresses, loads, and material properties. They would have demanded rigorous inspections at every stage of construction. None of this was properly done for the molasses tank. The very materials used were compromised. The steel plates, which formed the tank's massive shell, were found to be thinner than required for a vessel of its size and capacity, especially one holding a substance as dense and heavy as molasses. Steel, like any material, has a yield strength, a point beyond which it will deform or fracture. The steel chosen for the tank, already on the lower end of the necessary thickness, was simply not robust enough to withstand the immense internal pressures it would inevitably face. But perhaps the most glaring and catastrophic flaw lay in the riveting. Imagine, if you will, the sheer number of rivets needed to hold together a tank of this magnitude. Thousands upon thousands of them, each one a tiny point of connection, collectively bearing the monumental weight of 2.3 million gallons of syrup. These rivets were the arteries and veins of the tank's structural integrity, and they were tragically inadequate. Investigations after the disaster would reveal that the riveting was haphazard and poorly executed. Rivet holes were often misaligned, meaning that the rivets themselves were under uneven stress. Many were driven improperly, failing to create a tight, secure seal. Some rivets were simply missing, leaving gaps in the crucial seams. Think of it like a chain where some links are weak, some are improperly forged, and some are just not there at all. The chain may hold for a while, but it is fundamentally compromised. Furthermore, the design of the tank's seams, the places where the steel plates overlapped and were riveted together, was inadequate. There weren't enough rows of rivets, and the spacing between them was too generous. This meant that the shear stress on each individual rivet was far higher than it should have been. It was a cumulative effect. Thinner steel, poorly placed and poorly driven rivets, and an overall design that fundamentally underestimated the forces at play. Crucially, after its construction, the tank was never subjected to a hydrostatic test. This is a standard and vital procedure for large storage vessels, where the tank is filled with water to test for leaks and structural integrity, before it's put into service with its intended contents. Water, being less dense than molasses, would have still exerted significant pressure, and a hydrostatic test would almost certainly have revealed Degaussing's inherent weaknesses. Leaks would have been apparent, rivets would have popped, and the true danger would have been exposed. But the company, eager to get the tank operational, skipped this critical safety step entirely. They simply filled it with molasses, assuming, perhaps, that if it looked strong, it must be strong. It was an assumption born of ignorance and haste, and it would prove devastatingly wrong. From its very first filling in 1915, the tank was a source of concern. It didn't just hold molasses, it leaked molasses. Residents living nearby quickly grew accustomed to the sight of dark, sticky rivulets oozing from the tanks, seams staining steel plates a deep, glistening brown. Children, ever curious and resourceful, would often bring pails to collect the sweet syrup that seeped out, a seemingly innocent detail that, in retrospect, takes on a chilling significance. They were, in effect, drawing from a ticking time bomb. But it wasn't just the visible leaks. The tank made noise. From deep within its metallic shell, residents reported hearing strange rumblings, groans, and creaks, especially when new shipments of molasses arrived, topping off the immense vessel. The ground around the tank would sometimes tremble underfoot. These were not the normal sounds of an industrial facility. These were the sounds of a structure under immense, unbearable stress, crying out a warning that no one in authority chose to heed. One of the most persistent complainers was a local resident named Isaac Gonzalez, who often walked past the tank on his way home. He repeatedly reported the alarming leaks and the unsettling noises to the Purity Distilling Company. His concerns, and those of other residents, were consistently dismissed or downplayed. The company's response was not to investigate the structural integrity of their massive leaking tank, but rather to paint it brown. The idea, apparently, was to make the dark molasses leaks less visible against a similarly colored background. Superficial attempt to mask a deep-seated problem. It was an act of willful blindness, a clear prioritization of appearance over safety. There were even more specific alarming incidents. During one of its initial fillings, the tank actually began to rupture, with rivets popping out like gunshots. Work crews had to scramble to patch the immediate damage, reinforcing the weakened sections with steel bands. This was not a minor incident. It was a clear, undeniable sign of catastrophic structural failure in waiting. Any responsible engineer or company would have immediately emptied the tank, conducted a thorough inspection, and undertaken significant repairs, or ideally rebuilt it entirely. Purity Distilling did not. They patched it up, declared it fixed, and continued to fill it with molasses, effectively setting a precedent that the tank was good enough, despite its obvious and repeated protests. Let's delve deeper into the nature of molasses itself, for it was not just any liquid the tank held. Molasses is an incredibly dense and viscous substance. It is significantly heavier than water, weighing approximately 12 pounds per gallon. Compared to water's 8.3 pounds, this seemingly small difference translates into an enormous increase in total weight when you are talking about 2.3 million gallons. The sheer mass of the molasses exerted an immense outward pressure on the tank's walls and seams, a pressure far greater than the structure was designed to withstand. Its viscosity, too, played a role. Unlike water, which flows relatively freely, molasses is thick and sluggish. This property, combined with its density, meant that any internal movement or shifting within the tank would transmit powerful, slow-motion forces against the walls. When a new, warm shipment of molasses was pumped into the tank, it would create thermal stresses. The warm molasses would expand, pushing against the already strained walls, while the colder molasses, already in the tank, would retain its density. These temperature differentials, especially on a day like January 15th, which was unseasonably warm, would exacerbate the internal pressures. Imagine a colossal volume of syrup, its weight pressing down, its thermal properties causing it to expand and contract, all within a thin, poorly riveted shell. It was a recipe for disaster. The cumulative stress on the weakened structure was relentless. For 4 years, the tank endured the filling and emptying cycles, expansions and contractions, the constant outward push of its heavy contents. Each time it was filled, the stress increased. Each time it groaned, its structural integrity was further compromised. It was like bending a piece of metal back and forth repeatedly. Eventually, it will fracture. The Purity Distilling Company was, in essence, subjecting their tank to a slow-motion stress test, one that it was destined to fail. The corporateculture at Purity Distilling and its parent company, United States Industrial Alcohol, prioritized profit margins above all else. The cost of proper engineering, of using thicker steel, of robust riveting, and of conducting essential safety tests would have been seen as an unnecessary expense, a drag on their wartime profits. This was not a company that would pause its operations to thoroughly investigate a few leaks or some creaking noises. They were driven by deadlines and contracts, and the tank, however flawed, was a mens to an end. There was an implicit, and perhaps even explicit, dismissal of the inherent danger. After all, it was just molasses, a sweet, harmless substance, right? It wasn't gasoline or gunpowder. It wasn't perceived as an explosive threat. This fundamental misunderstanding of the physical properties of such a massive volume of dense liquid was a critical piece of the dark secret. They underestimated the sheer destructive power of 2 million gallons of anything, especially something as heavy and viscous as molasses. As that unseasonably warm January day dawned, the conditions within the tank were reaching a critical point. A fresh shipment of molasses had recently been pumped into the tank, filling it to near capacity. The temperature outside, hovering around 40 degrees Fahrenheit, was unusually mild for a Boston winter. This warmth would have caused the steel plates of the tank to expand slightly, placing additional strain on the already weakened seams and rivets. Simultaneously, the newly added, likely warmer molasses would have begun to thermally expand, adding even more internal pressure. Beneath the placid surface of the dark, sweet liquid, an invisible battle of forces was underway. The immense weight of the molasses pushed relentlessly outwards. The flimsy steel, already stressed beyond its limits, groaned under the burden. The faulty rivets, barely holding their purchase, were being pulled and sheared with every passing minute. Each unseen movement, each subtle expansion, brought the tank closer to its breaking point. The constant rumbling and creaking that residents had grown to ignore or dismiss were the last, desperate cries of a doomed structure. The engineers, if they had been present, would have heard the ominous sounds of metalphage, the subtle shifts that herald impending failure. But no engineers were listening. No safety inspectors were on site. And no one inside the Purity Distilling Company truly understood the monstrous potential contained within their cheaply built vessel. The tank stood there, a silent behemoth, its dark secret simmering beneath its surface, waiting for the precise moment when the accumulated stresses, the flawed construction, and the sheer weight of its contents would converge. It was poised, unbeknownst to the bustling community around it, to unleash a horror that would forever stain the city's memory. The stage was set not just for a disaster, but for a bizarre, unforgettable tragedy that would defy belief. The giant tank, which had always seemed a permanent fixture, was about to tear itself apart, transforming the ordinary rhythm of a Boston morning into an unimaginable torrent of destruction. The dark secret, held captive for 4 long years, was finally about to erupt. The tank stood there, a silent behemoth, its dark secret simmering beneath its surface, waiting for the precise moment when the accumulated stresses, flawed construction, and the sheer weight of its contents would converge. It was poised, unbeknownst to the bustling community around it, to unleash a horror that would forever stain the city's memory. The stage was set not just for a disaster, but for a bizarre, unforgettable tragedy that would defy belief. The giant tank, which always seemed a permanent fixture, was about to tear itself apart, transforming the ordinary rhythm of a Boston morning into an unimaginable torrent of destruction. The dark secret, held captive for 4 long years, was finally about to erupt. 1919. The day of the wave, the morning of January 15, 1919, dawned with an uncharacteristic warmth for Boston in the middle of winter. The air, usually crisp and biting, carried a gentle, almost spring-like quality. With temperatures hovering in the low 40s, a pale, weak sun struggled through a hazy sky, casting a diffuse light over the bustling North End. It was a day that promised a brief reprieve from the season's usual chill. A day that felt too many, like a gift. No one could have known it would become one of the city's darkest. Commercial Street, which snaked along the waterfront, was already alive with the symphony of daily life. The cobblestones, still damp from the morning dew, gleamed faintly under the muted light. Horse-drawn carts rumbled past, their iron-shod hooves clattering a steady rhythm. Delivery wagons piled high with fresh produce and dry goods jostled alongside early automobiles, their engines sputtering a different kind of song. Pedestrians, bundled in coats and hats despite the mild air, hurried along the sidewalks, their breath misting faintly in the cool air as they went about their morning errands or made their way to work. Children, released from school for lunch or simply enjoying a break from indoor play, laughed and chased each other in the narrow alleys and open spaces near Northern Park, their shrill cries echoing merrily. A group of boys, their faces smudged with dirt, was gathered near the docks, skipping stones across the gray-green waters of Boston Harbor. The salty temps of the sea mingled with Thelis, pleasant yet familiar smell of coal smoke from passing tugboats and the pervasive, cloying sweetness that always seemed to hang in the air around the Purity Distilling Company's colossal molasses tank. Most residents had long grown accustomed to Thatsagori aroma, hardly noticing it anymore. It was simply part of the North End's unique olfactory tapestry. Workers at the nearby Public Works Department, having just finished their midday meal, were returning to their posts. Some were gathered on a smell-elevated platform enjoying a moment of camaraderie before the afternoon's labor began. Down at the docks, longshoremen continued the arduous work of loading and unloading cargo, their muscles straining with each heavy lift. On the elevated railway, Wick loomed high above Commercial Street. A train clattered by, its metallic shriek momentarily drowning out the street-level cacophony. People on their way home, or perhaps to appointments, rode comfortably above the everyday bustle, looking down on the ant-like activity below. Fire Station 31, a handsome brick building on Commercial Street, was a hub of activity. Firefighters, some still in their aprons from lunch, were cleaning equipment or sharing jokes, their powerful horses stamping impatiently in their stalls, sensing the familiar routines. Up at Cope's Hill Terrace, slightly elevated area offering a sweeping view of the harbor and the industrial landscape, a few people lingered, perhaps admiring the maritime panorama, or simply taking a moment of peace before rejoining the day's demands. A young girl just a few blocks away stood by her window, carefully arranging her hair, preparing to meet a friend. A teamster, driving his horse and cart, was just turning onto Commercial Street, his mind on the next delivery. It was precisely 12:30 p.m. The lunch hour was winding down, and the city was shifting gears into the afternoon's rhythm. The air was calm, the sky quiet, the sounds of human endeavor dominating the soundscape. Then, without warning, everything changed. A low, guttural rumble, unlike any sound heard before, emanated from the Purity Distilling Company's property. It wasn't the familiar creak and groan that residents had learned to ignore. This was deeper, more ominous, a sound that seemed to vibrate through the very ground. For a fleeting instant, a moment suspended between normalcy and catastrophe. A few people looked up, their brows furrowing in confusion. What was that? Before anyone could fully process the sound, before a single thought could coalesce into understanding, an unimaginably violent explosion ripped through the air. The colossal molasses tank, which had dominated the skyline for years, simply ceased to be. It didn't rupture or tear. It shattered. Steel plates, weighing tons, were ripped from their moorings with the force of a bomb, flying outwards like shrapnel. Rivets, which had barely held the structure together, became deadly projectiles, whistling through the air, capable of piercing flesh and bone with horrifying ease. A mighty roar, a sound that eyewitnesses would later describe as a combination of thunder, a cannon shot, and the explosive tearing of metal deafened the street. A plume of dark, thick, viscous molasses, estimated to be more than 2 million gallons, erupted upward, spraying against the pale sky. For a split second, it hung there, a monstrous, dark brown geyser, before gravity and the immense pressure of the remaining liquid asserted its dominance. What followed was not a flood, not a slow seep, but a wave. It's a dark, terrifying, incredibly powerful wave. It wasn't water. was liquid sugar, thick and dense, with the consistency of heavy syrup, and it moved with astonishing, lethal speed. Estimates would later place its initial velocity at a staggering 35 miles per hour, faster than many trains of the era. The wave was colossal, a sticky brown wall of destruction, estimated to be between 15 and 25 feet high. It surged outward, initially traveling in a northwesterly direction, directly towards Commercial Street and the densely populated North End. The force of it was unimaginable. A viscous liquid hammer striking with the weight of a small mountain. It tore through everything in its path, transforming solid structures into kindling and living beings into helpless debris. The first casualties were the very buildings that stood closest to the tank. Shacks and smaller structures were simply pulverized, their timbers splintering and collapsing as if made of paper. Larger, more substantial brick buildings groaned under the impact, their foundations ripped apart, their walls crumbling inward. Homes were lifted from their foundations, twisted and spun. The entire landscape was instantaneously reconfigured into a scene of chaotic devastation. The Public Works Department building, a three-story structure where men were still eating their lunches or returning to work, bore the brunt of the initial surge. The wave struck it with such force that it was completely torn from its foundations, collapsing into a heap of brick and wood, its inhabitants trapped within its rapidly sinking wreckage. 8 of the men inside were killed instantly. On Commercial Street, the scene was one of utter pandemonium. The roar of the wave was deafening, a prelude to the horrific sight of a dark, soot-glistening wall approaching with terrifying speed. Horses, sensing the impending doom, reared up in their harnesses, whinnying in terror, only to be swallowed whole by the viscous tide, their struggles brief and futile. Carts and wagons were picked up and hurled like toys, their contents scattered and smashed. Automobiles, still a novelty, were swept away as if they were bath toys, crushed and twisted into unrecognizable masses of metal. One of the most dramatic impacts occurred when the waves slammed into the elevated railway structure. The steel girders and supports, designed to withstand the weight of heavy trains, buckled and twisted under the enormous, unrelenting pressure of the molasses. A train, which had just passed the Purity Distilling Company's property minutes before, was already on the tracks, nearing the point of impact. The force of the wave was so immense that it dislodged an entire section of the elevated tracks, causing a passenger car to be thrown from its line, dangling precariously over the street below, its occupants screaming in terror, miraculously clinging to life. Fire Station 31, a symbol of safety and readiness, was also directly in the wave's path. The firefighters inside, startled by the initial explosion, barely had time to react. The wave hit the station with brutal force, sweeping through the ground floor, overwhelming everything in its path. The powerful fire horses, trapped in their stalls, were submerged and drowned almost immediately. The station itself was shifted several feet from its foundation, and one wall was partially ripped away. Firefighter George Leahy, one of the men inside, was struck by a piece of the collapsing building, fatally injured. Others were buried under debris and molasses, struggling desperately to breathe. The human toll was immediate and catastrophic. People caught in the open, pedestrians, workers, and children playing in the streets, had virtually no chance. The molasses, unlike water, was incredibly dense and sticky. It moved with the force of a tidal wave, but once it engulfed a person, it clung with an inescapable grip. It wasn't just the sheer impact that killed. Victims were drowned in the thick syrup, suffocated by its density, or crushed by the debris it carried. Witnesses, those who stood just at the periphery of the disaster, or watched from slightly higher ground, described a scene of surreal horror. They saw people, horses, and entire buildings simply disappear beneath the dark, churning mass, broken only by gurgling sounds and the desperate cries of those trapped. One young girl, just moments after styling her hair, saw a wave from her window. She would later recount seeing a massive dark brown wall, higher than the rooftops, bearing down on her neighborhood. The image was burned into her memory forever. A liquid behemoth, devouring everything in its path. 8 Teamster, Frank Mayer, was driving his horse and cart when the wave hit. He later recalled a sensation of being lifted into the air, spun around, and then plunged into a cold, sweet, suffocating darkness. He fought desperately, instinctively ethering, somehow managing to break free of the syrup script and pull himself onto a floating piece of wreckage. Gasping for air, coated head to toe in the sticky goo. His horse, tragically, was not so lucky. The distinct, overwhelming smell of molasses, usually merely a background odor, now became a noxious, suffocating presence. It permeated everything, filling the air, clinging to clothes, hair, and skin. It was no longer a sweet, comforting aroma, but the scent of death and destruction, sickeningly cloying, making movement almost impossible for those submerged. As the initial wave passed, leaving a trail of unimaginable weka, the molasses began to spread. Slowly, but inexorably, cooling in the winter air. It flowed into basements, coating them in a thick, dark goo. It seeped into drains and sewers, clogging the city's subterranean artises. The streets, once paved with cobblestones, were now rivers of dark brown goo. Some areas knee-deep, others waist-deep, trapping people, animals, and debris alike. The initial impact was devastating, but the molasses' enduring stickiness and density would make rescue efforts almost impossible. The horror of the moment was amplified by its sheer unexpectedness and the bizarre nature of the destructive force. This wasn't a fire, a flood, or an earthquake, recognizable disasters with established emergency protocols. This was a wave of syrup, a sweet, dark, suffocating monster that defied comprehension. The minds of those who witnessed it struggled to process what their eyes were seeing. Quiet Boston afternoon had, in the space of mere seconds, been transformed into a nightmarish landscape of chaos, destruction, and an incomprehensible sticky horror. The day of the wave had unleashed its deadly torrent, and Boston would never be the same. The day of the wave had unleashed its deadly torrent, and Boston would never be the same. The initial thunderous roar of the bursting tank, a sound described by some as a cannon shot, by others as a colossal train derailing, had signaled the beginning of an unimaginable catastrophe. For a fleeting instant, the bustling North End neighborhood, with its vibrant Italian-American community and industrious port activities, simply ceased to exist as it had been known. In its place, a monstrous dark brown wave, 25 feet high and 160 feet wide, surged forth, devouring everything in its path with an almost malevolent hunger. This was not a wave of water, swift and momentarily destructive, receding to reveal what lay beneath. This was a liquid wall of pure, unadulterated molasses, moving at an estimated 35 miles per hour. Its density was nearly 12 times that of water, giving it an unparalleled crushing force. Imagine the unimaginable weight of that much viscous liquid, accelerating with the brutal momentum of a runaway freight train. Buildings that had stood for decades, their foundations rooted in Boston's historic soil, were simply swept away, their timber and brick reduced to kindling in an instant. The very ground trembled, not with the tremor of an earthquake, but with the shuddering impact of a dense, sugary deluge. The first casualties were swift and brutal. Workers at the nearby Purity Distilling Company, many enjoying their lunch break in a ground-floor office, had no warning. The wave hit the building with the force of a battering ram, collapsing it in on itself, burying men alive under tons of brick, steel, and suffocating syrup. Wagons, delivery trucks, and even a firehouse were lifted clean off their foundations, tossed and splintered like children's toys caught in a storm. Horses, the lifeblood of transport in 1919, reared in terror, their whinnies abruptly cut short as they were swallowed by the advancing tide. One of the most striking images of the disaster forever etched into the city's memory was the fate of the elevated train structure. The Purity distilling tank had stood adjacent to the tracks of the Boston Elevated Railway. As the wave of molasses exploded outwards, struck one of the immense steel girders supporting the track, ripping it from its moorings. The tracks, twisted and mangled, sagged precariously, narrowly avoiding a complete collapse that would have sent a loaded train plunging into the syrupy abyss. A train was, in fact, approaching the elevated station at the time, its passengers, blissfully unaware of the horror unfolding just moments ahead. The quick thinking of a motorman who saw the devastation ahead brought the train to a screeching halt, saving countless lives. Yet the impact had been so powerful that even the steel girders of the elevated line, built to withstand the constant vibrations of heavy trains, were visibly bent, a testament to the immense liquid force. The initial shock wave dispersed rapidly, but the molasses did not stop. Unlike water, which flows and then drains, molasses is a substance of enduring, clinging tenacity. After the initial surge, the sticky tide continued to flow outwards, not as a swift current, but as an inexorable, slow-motion engulfment. It began to pool in low-lying areas, in basements, in culverts, and along the cobblestone streets. Imagine the streets of the North End, typically teeming with pedestrians, vendors, and horse-drawn carts, now transformed into a bizarre brown river, some areas knee-deep, others a deadly waist-deep morass. The properties of molasses made this disaster uniquely terrifying. Its immense viscosity meant that anything caught within it was not merely wet, but utterly enveloped, bound, and trapped. People who had survived the initial impact found themselves struggling, sinking deeper with every movement. The effort required to pull a foot from the clinging goo was Herculean. It was like trying to run through wet cement, only this cement was sweet, warm, and horrifyingly alive. The pressure on submerged limbs was immense, making it difficult to breathe, let alone move. Panic would inevitably set in, leading to further thrashing, which only served to hasten one's descent into the sweet, suffocating darkness. Children, often playing in the streets or returning home from school, were particularly vulnerable. Their smaller stature meant that even relatively shallow depths of molasses could prove fatal. Stories emerged of children playing in the immediate vicinity of the tank, their laughter turning to screams as the wave descended upon them. They were not merely drowned. They were engulfed, sealed, and smothered. One can only imagine the terror of a small child, eyes wide with incomprehension, as the syrupy monster loomed, then enveloped them. The sensory assault was overwhelming. Air, already thick with the general industrial smells of a port city, became saturated with the cloying, sickly sweet aroma of molasses. It wasn't the pleasant, comforting smell of baked goods. It was an omnipresent, suffocating miasma. It coated the throat, stung the eyes, and clung to every fiber of clothing. Survivors would later recall the smell lingering for weeks, even months, a constant, sickening reminder of the tragedy. It permeated homes, businesses, and even the very soil. As the molasses began to cool in the bracing January air, its consistency grew even thicker, more akin to tar than liquid. This transition from a fast-moving wave to a slow, immovable mass created a second, insidious phase of the disaster. People who had been able to cling to floating debris or partially extricate themselves from thessalhour depths now found themselves stuck fast. The molasses, cooling and hardening around them, held them in a deadly embrace. Rescuers, when they eventually arrived, would face the daunting task of freeing victims from this hardening tomb. The landscape for was a grotesque tableau. Buildings lay shattered, their contents strewn amidst the brown goo. Furniture, personal belongings, and business inventories were half submerged, coated in a glistening, dark film. The sheer volume of molasses, over 2 million gallons, or roughly 26 million pounds, transformed the familiar urban environment into something alien and surreal. One observer described it as if the city had been struck by a brown, sticky bomb. The devastation wasn't limited to human life and structures. The North End was home to many working animals, particularly horses that pulled delivery carts and trolleys. For these animals, escape was almost impossible. Their powerful legs, accustomed to pulling heavy loads, were useless against the adhesive grip of the molasses. They panicked, struggled, and ultimately succumbed, their massive bodies sinking into the viscous fluid. Witnesses recounted the heartbreaking sight of horses, half submerged, their struggles slowing as the molasses claimed them. The plight of these animals added another layer of grim reality to the horror, highlighting the indiscriminate nature of the disaster. The immediate aftermath was pure chaos. People, many of them injured, dazed, and covered head to toe in the dark syrup, wandered aimlessly, struggling to comprehend the unbelievable events that had just unfolded. The familiar world had been turned upside down, literally and figuratively, in the blink of an eye. The sheer unexpectedness of the disaster amplified the terror. No one anticipates being engulfed by a wave of molasses. It defied all logic, all experience, all preparedness. Emergency services, when they were finally alerted, struggled to respond. The dense, sticky nature of the molasses made it incredibly difficult for rescue workers to navigate the affected area. Firefighters, police officers, and volunteers found their boots sinking into the muck, making every step an exhausting battle. They needed to move quickly to reach survivors, but the very ground beneath them conspired to slow their progress. Ladders and ropes, standard tools in rescue operations, proved largely ineffective against the clinging, immovable syrup. They had never trained for a disaster quite like this. The North End, a tightly packed maze of narrow streets and multi-story tenement buildings, became a death trap. Many buildings, already old and structurally compromised, simply crumpled under the immense force and weight of the molasses. Basements became death chambers, filled instantly with the suffocating goo. Homes were invaded, their ground floors swamped, trapping families who had been going about their daily routines. Imagine being in your kitchen, preparing a meal, and suddenly a wave of dark, sweet liquid smashes through your wall, carrying with it debris and engulfing everything in its path. The sheer volume of debris-splintered wood, twisted metal, shattered glass, and the personal belongings of hundreds of people further complicated rescue efforts. This flotsam and jetsam, all coated in molasses, created an ever-shifting, treacherous landscape. Rescuers had to contend not only with the sticky fluid but also with sharp edges, heavy objects, and the constant threat of further structural collapse. Every attempt to pull a victim free was an agonizing process, requiring multiple individuals and immense physical effort. As the hours passed, the molasses continued its slow, inexorable work. It cooled, hardened, and deepened, creating a macabre amber-like effect, suspending objects and bodies in a grotesque tableau.
The initial explosive violence had given way to a silent, sticky stranglehold. The once vibrant streets became a mournful expanse of brown,
broken only by the occasional glint of sunlight on the molasses' surface, reflecting a distorted image of the shattered city. The sounds of the city, the rumble of carts, the chatter of neighbors, the distant clang of the harbor were replaced by a lingslands, broken only by the desperate cries of the trapped and the strained grunts of the rescuers. The stories of individual courage and tragedy began to emerge from the chaos. People risked their own lives, wading into the treacherous syrup to pull loved ones and strangers to safety. One could see the desperate hands reaching out from the molasses, a silent plea for salvation. The struggle was not just against the molasses, but against time. As the cold of the January day and the increasing thickness off, the syrup threatened to claim more lives. The Great Molasses Flood Unleashed was not merely an event. It was a horrifying, multifaceted assault on a community, a moment when the unimaginable became brutally, stickily real. It was a disaster born of negligence, delivered by a sweet, dark tide that would forever mark the memory of Boston. The initial explosive violence of the molasses wave had given way to a silent, sticky stranglehold, but the horror was far from over. The immediate aftermath was a landscape of grotesque beauty and terrifying stillness, broken only by the cries for help and the desperate sounds of struggle. This was the opening act of a protracted, agonizing drama, the relentless aftermath of rescue, recovery, and the community's eventual grim resignation. Aftermath, rescue, recovery, and resignation as the last echoes of the metallic roar faded. An eerie hush descended upon Boston's North End, a silence soon shattered by a cacophony of human cries and the mournful whinnies of trapped horses. What began as an unimaginable catastrophe swiftly transitioned into a desperate race against time and the chilling January cold. The sticky, dark tide, once a roaring wave, began its insidious work of solidifying, turning the disaster zone into a treacherous quicksand-like trap. First to respond with remarkable speed and courage were the 116 cadets from the Massachusetts Nautical School, whose training ship, the USS Nantucket, was docked mere blocks away at the playground pier. Lieutenant Commander H.J. Copeland, upon hearing the cataclysmic roar, immediately issued a call to quarters, and his young charges sprinted towards the disaster. Not knowing the sheer scope of the horror awaiting them, they plunged into the knee-deep molasses, their uniforms quickly coated in the viscous, copper-colored goo. Bravely pulling out survivors and working to prevent curious onlookers from inadvertently hindering the frantic efforts, within minutes, The disciplined ranks of Boston's police and fire departments arrived, their sirens cutting through the thickening air, adding to the growing sense of urgent chaos. But even these seasoned professionals were ill-equipped for the surreal challenge before them. Moving through the molasses was an agonizing struggle. They clung to their boots, slowed their every step, and sometimes outright trapped them. Many rescuers themselves became stuck and had to be pulled to safety. The heavy, sweet-smelling substance created an almost impenetrable barrier, making it difficult to reach those caught beneath the wreckage or submerged in its depths. Red Cross nurses, with their characteristic selflessness, were also among the early arrivals. Some bravely waded into the molasses to tend to the injured, while others focused on keeping those rescued warm, offering comfort and sustenance to the exhausted workers who toiled without thought for themselves. The sheer number of casualties quickly overwhelmed local facilities, leading doctors and surgeons to establish a makeshift hospital in a nearby building, transforming it into a triage center where the injured could be assessed and receive urgent care. Ambulances, including vehicles from the Naval Hospital in Chelsea, began a steady stream of transporting the wounded. The scene was a living nightmare, a tableau of human and animal suffering. Only an upheaval, a thrashing about in the sticky mass, showed where any life was, one observer grimly reported. The disaster claimed 21 human lives and injured approximately 150 others, a toll that would climb as the days progressed. The victims ranged in age from a heartbreaking 10 years old to 78, reflecting the indiscriminate nature of the disaster. Pasquale in Tosca, a 10-year-old boy, was struck and killed by a train car that had been ripped from its tracks and flung through the air. Fireman George Leahy, one of the men playing cards in the Engine 31 firehouse, which had been swept off its foundations and virtually destroyed, was trapped in a tiny crawl space in the basement, struggling to keep his head above the rising molasses for nearly 4 hours before he finally succumbed to asphyxiation. His was a particularly harrowing end, one that would later play a role in the legal battles to come. Animals suffered just as profoundly. Dozens of horses, integral to the city's commerce and transportation, were caught in the syrupy trap. They died like so many flies on sticky flypaper, their struggles only embedding them deeper into the viscous fluid. The desperate sight of these magnificent critters suffocating led police officers to mercifully shoot them, ending their prolonged agony. The molasses itself presented an evolving and increasingly brutal challenge. While it moved at an astonishing 35 miles per hour when first unleashed, its nature as a non-Newtonian fluid meant its viscosity changed dramatically with temperature. The relatively mild January day, unseasonably warm at 40 degrees Fahrenheit, had allowed the newly added warm molasses to flow quickly, thickening into a dense, glue-like substance that made escape and rescue efforts exponentially harder. What began as a flood quickly became a giant sticky block, trapping people in debris in a macabre amber. Victims found were often glazed over in molasses, making identification a grim, challenging task. Some were swept far from the initial blast zone. The body of Cesare Nicolo, a wagon driver, was not recovered from Boston Harbor until nearly 4 months after the flood, and another body was found 11 days after the spill. The debris, too, was a constant menace. Splintered wood, twisted metal, and shattered glass, all coated in molasses, formed an ever-shifting, treacherous terrain. Rescuers had to navigate this hazardous environment, contending with sharp edges, heavy objects, and the constant threat of further structural collapse from damaged buildings.
Ow.
Every attempt to free a victim was a grueling, multi-person effort, demanding immense physical strength and unwavering resolve. The immediate rescue phase, a harrowing 4-day ordeal, slowly transitioned into an even more monumental undertaking: the recovery and cleanup. The sheer scale of the mess was almost incomprehensible. More than 2 million gallons of molasses had inundated the North End, covering streets, homes, and businesses. The cleanup crews, comprising hundreds of people, faced a problem unlike any seen before. Molasses, by its very nature, is incredibly difficult to remove. It doesn't simply wash away like water. It sticks, permeates, and hardens. Initial efforts were likely frustratingly slow and ineffective. It was soon discovered, however, that salt water was the key to breaking down the sugary substance. Fire hoses were employed, but instead of fresh water, they began pumping salt water directly from Boston Harbor onto the molasses-laden streets. The Engine 31 fireboat, ironically from the firehouse that had been devastated by the flood, played a crucial role, tirelessly spraying the area. This method, while effective, created a new set of challenges. The harbor itself was quickly contaminated, becoming brown with molasses until summer or for months afterward. While the environmental impact wasn't a documented concern in 1919, it's clear that the marine life in Boston Harbor suffered negative consequences. After the bulk of the molasses had been flushed into the harbor, crews used vast quantities of sand to absorb the remaining sticky residue from streets and surfaces. Yet, even with these efforts, the cleanup in the immediate disaster zone took weeks. With an estimated 87,000 man-hours dedicated to the monumental task, the arduous process involved brooms, shovels, picks, chisels, and even steam to remove the hardened, congealed molasses, which often required literally chiseling bodies and debris free. But the problem wasn't confined to the north end, the molasses. Clinging to the shoes and clothing of rescuers, cleanup workers, and the thousands of curious onlookers who flocked to the scene was tracked throughout Thessaly. It spread to subway platforms, coating the seats of trains and streetcars, grimily adhering to pay telephone handsets, and even finding its way into countless homes across Greater Boston. As one newspaper famously reported, everything that a Bostonian touched was sticky. This pervasive stickiness meant that the cleanup extended far beyond the immediate blast zone, taking much longer to fully clear the rest of Boston and its suburbs. The long-term impact of the Great Molasses Flood was deeply etched into the fabric of the North End and the memory of Boston. One of the most famous and persistent legacies was the smell. For decades afterwards, particularly on hot summer days, residents swore they could still catch the faint, sweet, and oddly sickening aroma of molasses lingering in the air. Stephen Puleo, author of Dark Tide, The Great Boston Molasses Flood of 1919, recounted a meter reader from the late 1950s who could still smell
molasses in the basements of buildings across from the tank's original site.
Basements that had been filled with the syrup up to the first floor. The disaster left an immense economic toll. With property damage estimated at roughly $100 million in today's money, homes were flattened or knocked off their foundations, businesses were ruined, and the city's infrastructure, including the elevated train tracks, was severely damaged. Many lost everything. The Boston Post reported the poignant story of an elderly Italian man, George Cacavis, who spent days watching crews desperately search through his molasses-filled banana storage cellar. Trying to retrieve $4,400 he had carefully squirreled away in a cigar box a fortune for the time. The disaster effectively brought an end to Boston. Its 300-year history is a lucrative center for the molasses industry. Beyond the physical and economic devastation, there was a profound emotional and psychological burden on the survivors and the community. The trauma of witnessing such a bizarre and sudden catastrophe, the loss of loved ones, and the arduous, messy recovery left an indelible mark. For those who survived, the memory oft wave. The struggle and the lingering, cloying scent of molasses would forever be intertwined with their experience of Boston. The North End, largely a vibrant community of Italian and Irish immigrants, had borne the brunt of the tragedy, and a sense of collective loss and bewilderment permeated the district. The immediate shock and urgent desperation of the rescue efforts eventually gave way to a somber resignation as the true scale of the disaster became clear. The community buried its dead, mourned its losses, and began the slow, painful process of rebuilding. Yet, this resignation was not passive acceptance. It was tempered by a growing sense of injustice. It was clear to many that this was not merely an act of God. Buddha man-made tragedy, preventable and inexcusable. The crude, shoddy construction of the tank, its persistent leaks, and the company's blatant disregard for safety concerns were facts that could not be buried under layers of sticky syrup or twisted metal. This mounting realization would soon ignite a new battle, one fought not in the streets off the North End, but in the hallowed halls of justice, where the true cost of corporate negligence would finally be laid bare. The immediate shock and urgent desperation of the rescue efforts eventually gave way to a somber resignation as the true scale of the disaster became clear. The community buried its dead, mourned its losses, and began the slow, painful process of rebuilding. Yet this resignation was not passive acceptance. It was tempered by a growing sense of injustice. It was clear to many that this was not merely an act of God, but a man-made tragedy, preventable and inexcusable. The crude, shoddy construction of the tank, its persistent leaks, and the company's blatant disregard for safety concerns were facts that could not be buried under layers of sticky syrup or twisted metal. This mounting realization would soon ignite a new battle, one fought not in the streets of the North End but in the hallowed halls of justice, where the true cost of corporate negligence would finally be laid bare. In the aftermath of the Great Molasses Flood, a heavy silence settled over Boston's North End, soon followed by a clamor for answers and, more importantly, for justice. The swift and brutal destruction had left 21 people dead and another 150 injured, not to mention the immense property damage that ran into the millions even in $1,919. The tragedy, so sudden and bizarre, ignited a deep-seated danger among the working-class immigrant communities who bore the brunt of the disaster. This wasn't merely a terrible accident. It felt like a profound betrayal. From the tangled wreckage and the lingering sickly sweet scent of molasses rose the determined voices of the victims and their families. They demanded accountability, and their pleas would initiate one of the longest and most expensive civil cases in Massachusetts history. Initially, 119 separate lawsuits were filed against United States Industrial Alcohol Company, the corporate giant that owned the Purity Distilling Company and its ill-fated tank. These individual claims, representing loss of life, devastating injuries, and shattered livelihoods, were eventually consolidated into a single, massive class action lawsuit. This was a relatively new legal innovation at the time, making the case a significant landmark in American legal history. Given the sheer complexity of the disaster, the multitude of plaintiffs, and the technical nature of the evidence, the Massachusetts Superior Court opted for an unconventional approach. Instead of sending the case directly to a jury, they appointed an impartial auditor or master to hear all the evidence, determine liability, and issue a report. This report would then guide whether the case proceeded to a full civil trial. The man chosen for this monumental task was Colonel Hugh W. Ogden, a 40-year-old New England attorney with a distinguished background as a World War I military judge advocate. Ogden was known for his tough, fair-minded approach and his meticulous adherence to evidence, qualities that would be sorely tested in the years to come. The hearings commenced in August 1920, more than 18 months after the flood. In the sweltering Suffolk County Courthouse in downtown Boston, Damon Everett Hall, a prominent attorney, led the charge for the plaintiffs. In his opening statement, Hall painted a vivid and grim picture of the catastrophe, calling it one of the worst catastrophes which had visited the city of Boston. Argued passionately that the flood had taught the people of Boston that gold molasses has death-dealing and destructive powers equal to the tornado or the cyclone when it is suddenly unloosed. Hall's central thesis was clear. This was a preventable, man-made disaster born of corporate negligence. He contended that USIA had cut corners in construction, ignored blatant warnings about the tank's faulty design, and placed such a dangerous structure in a densely populated neighborhood with little regard for safety. To bolster their case, the plaintiffs presented a mountain of evidence and a long procession of witnesses. Among the most crucial was Arthur Gell, the treasurer of Purity Distilling, who had overseen the tank's construction. Under questioning, Gell made a series of damning admissions. He had no architectural or engineering experience. He had neglected to conduct basic safety tests, such as filling the tank with water to check for leaks, and he had repeatedly ignored warning signs. The tank, built in a rush to meet wartime demand for industrial alcohol, had been filled almost immediately after its construction in 1915, untested and ultimately unsafe. Gell's testimony would become a cornerstone of Ogden's final ruling. Eyewitnesses from the North End community provided poignant and powerful testimony. They spoke of the tank groaning and rumbling ominously for weeks, even months, before the collapse. Many testified to seeing molasses constantly sping from the tank seams, a persistent weeping that had become a local phenomenon. Children would even collect the leaked syrup in cups. In a blatant attempt to hide these alarming leaks, USCA had painted the tank a matching brown color. Caulkers like Patrick Kennelly and John Urquhart confirmed they had been repeatedly hired to patch the tank, often having to wipe away fresh molasses just to apply their sealant. One of these resealing jobs had occurred only a month before the disaster. Further, the plaintiffs brought in expert witnesses to scientifically dismantle USIA's claims. Charles Spofford, a distinguished civil engineering professor from MIT and an authority on structural engineering and bridge design, was a key figure. Spofford meticulously examined pieces of the ruptured tank in MIT laboratories. His findings were unequivocal. The steel plates used for the tank walls were significantly thinner than the original plans had specified. In some places only half as thick as they should have been for a tank of that size. Furthermore, the tank lacked enough rivets to properly fasten the plates, and the steel itself was found to be brittle, lacking sufficient manganese. Spofford calculated that the fatal load of 2.3 million gallons exerted a pressure of 31,000 pounds per square inch on the tank walls, nearly double the safe limit of 18,000 pounds per square inch. He concluded that the tank's factor of safety was a mere 1.8, whereas ordinary practice for such a structure called for a factor of 3 to 4. In his judgment, the tank was improperly designed, and its failure was due entirely to structural weakness. In stark contrast to the plaintiff's case of negligence, USIA's defense, led by the well-respected Harvard-trained attorney Charles Francis Choate, offered a very different explanation: sabotage. Choate argued that the tank had been intentionally blown up by evilly disposed persons, specifically Italian anarchists. This theory, however outlandish it might seem today, held a certain plausibility in the politically charged atmosphere of 1919. With Boston itself experiencing 40 explosive incidents in the year leading up to the flood. In 1918, during World War I, an anonymous individual had even called USIA's office, threatening to destroy the tank with dynamite. Choate hoped to appeal to potential cultural and personal biases against the largely Italian immigrant community in the North End. To support their bombing theory, USIA spared no expense, reportedly spending over $50,000 on expert witnesses. They brought in metallurgists who conducted experiments with replica tanks, claiming that dynamite could produce the twisting metal plates observed in the wreckage. Choate argued that much of the damage was from the explosive blast, not the molasses itself. State Police chemist Walter Wedger, an experienced investigator of explosions, initially testified that the collapse was caused by a high explosive like dynamite or nitroglycerin. Surprisingly, some engineers, including professors from MIT and Harvard, also testified that the tank was structurally sound, though they conceded its safety factor was less than ideal. However, the defense's elaborate sabotage theory began to unravel under scrutiny. Hall, in his cross-examination, systematically dismantled Wedger's testimony, making the expert's claims fall apart. Crucially, no physical evidence of a bomb, such as fragments or an explosive crater, was ever found at the scene. Furthermore, testimonies from sailors who had been stationed on ships in the harbor, men intimately familiar with the sounds of explosives from their wartime service, stated emphatically that the metallic roar-off, the tank bursting, was nothing like the sound of a high explosive detonation. The trial dragged on for an unprecedented 5.5 years, marked by its immense scope and complexity. Over 1,000 witnesses, some sources say as many as 3,000, testified, ranging from flood survivors and USIA employees to explosives experts, metallurgists, and engineers. More than 1,500 exhibits were introduced, and the transcribed testimony alone ran to an astonishing 25,000 pages. Throughout these years, Colonel Ogden, the auditor, meticulously sifted through every piece of evidence. He disregarded any attempts to appeal to cultural or personal biases, focusing solely on the facts presented. Finally, in April 1925, more than 6 years after the flood, Hugh Ogden delivered his 51-page special report to the Massachusetts Superior Court. His ruling was a definitive victory for the victims and a landmark decision against corporate irresponsibility. ASIA was found directly liable for the disaster. Ogden concluded that the catastrophe was not an act of sabotage, the direct result of the tank's structural failure, stemming from poor planning and lack of oversight. He cited the rushed, haphazard construction, the inadequate thickness of the steel plates, the flawed riveting, and the company's egregious neglect of safety concerns, including ignoring the persistent leaks and groaning noises. The company, in its rush for wartime profits and to potentially outpace prohibition, had compromised safety to maximize production and minimize costs. Following Ogden's ruling, USIA was ordered to pay damages. The company ultimately paid $628,000 to the victims and their families. While this sum might seem modest by today's standards, it was a significant amount for the time. In today's money, it would be equivalent to approximately $8 million. Other estimates place the modern buying power between $9.1 million and $10.3 million, with relatives of those killed reportedly receiving around $7,000 per victim, equivalent to about $127,000 in 2024. By the time the final settlement was paid, the physical scars of the molasses flood on Commercial Street had largely healed. The debris had been cleared, and new construction had replaced the wreckage. However, the invisible scars on the community ran deep, and the memory of the disaster, along with the lingering sweet scent of molasses in the North End, would persist for decades on warm summer days. The legal battle following the Great Molasses Flood proved to be a pivotal moment in American history. It was one of the first class action lawsuits against a major corporation and established crucial legal precedents. More importantly, it spurred significant changes in industrial regulation and engineering practices. The tragedy highlighted the absolute necessity of rigorous structural inspections, proper engineering oversight, and the implementation of robust building codes. It led to new regulations stipulating that engineers must sign and seal plans, building inspectors must examine projects, and architects must show their work. The molasses flood, a bizarre and terrifying event, ultimately became a powerful if sticky lesson in corporate responsibility and public safety. The molasses flood, a bizarre and terrifying event, ultimately became a powerful if sticky lesson in corporate responsibility and public safety. And indeed, that lesson resonated far beyond the shattered timbers and molasses-coated streets of Boston, leaving an enduring legacy in engineering, law, and memory. The disaster forced a fundamental rethinking of how large industrial structures were designed, built, and regulated. Before the flood, many believed that if a structure simply stood, it was safe. USIA's tank was a testament to the dangers of that complacent attitude. In the wake of the tragedy, new building codes were not just written, but enforced with a newfound rigor. Engineers were now required to sign and seal their plans, staking their professional reputation on the integrity of their designs. Building inspectors, previously often overlooked or under-resourced, gained significant authority with mandates to scrutinize projects from the ground up, ensuring that materials, construction methods, and structural calculations met stringent new standards. This paradigm shift was crucial. It moved the responsibility for public safety from an unverified trust in corporations to a system of professional accountability and governmental oversight. The tragedy underscored the absolute necessity of rigorous structural analysis, material testing, and independent review for any large-scale construction, especially those housing potentially hazardous substances. It wasn't enough for a tank to merely hold its contents. It had to be designed to withstand all foreseeable stresses, with a substantial margin of safety built in. The era of unchecked industrial development, where profit often trumped precaution, began to wane, slowly giving way to a more regulated and safety-conscious approach to infrastructure development across the nation. Legally, the Great Molasses Flood was nothing short of revolutionary. As one of the earliest class-action lawsuits against a major corporation in American history, it charted new territory for victim compensation and corporate accountability. The painstaking, multi-year investigation by Auditor Hugh Ogden, his meticulous findings regarding USIA's negligence, and the eventual payout to victims and their families established critical precedents. It set a benchmark for proving corporate culpability in industrial accidents and offered a blueprint for how collective grievances could be addressed in court. This landmark case influenced future legislation and judicial interpretations regarding product liability, workplace safety, and environmental protection. solidifying the legal framework for holding powerful entities responsible when their actions or inactions cause widespread harm. The court's decision was more than just a financial settlement. It was a profound affirmation that even the largest and most influential companies were not above the law, and that ordinary citizens had the right to seek justice against them. It empowered future generations of lawyers and advocates to challenge corporate negligence, paving the way for better protections for workers, consumers, and the public at large. The molasses flood case became a foundational pillar in the ongoing evolution of American tort law, emphasizing that the human cost of cutting corners would not be tolerated. And then there's the memory. In Boston's North End, the story of the Great Molasses Flood endures, a unique and unforgettable chapter in the city's rich, often quirky history. For decades after the event, it was said that on hot summer days, a faint, sweet molasses scent could still be detected wafting through the streets near the old commercial street site. Though the physical scars have long since faded and new buildings stand where the tank once erupted, the tale itself has become a piece of local folklore passed down through generations. Historical markers commemorate the site, and walking tours often pause to recount the astonishing events of that January day. The sheer absurdity of a disaster caused by a wave of molasses, substance so benign in common understanding, only adds to its enduring fascination. It's a story that defies belief, yet is horrifyingly real, serving as a powerful reminder that danger can lurk in the most unexpected forms and places. Beyond Boston, the Great Molasses Flood stands as a bizarre, yet significant footnote in the annals of industrial accidents. A cautionary tale taught in engineering schools and remembered in history books. It's a testament to how an unimaginable tragedy can force crucial introspection, spur vital reforms, and leave an indelible, if sticky, mark on the collective consciousness, forever shaping how we build, how we legislate, and how we remember. And so, as the faint, sweet scent of molasses may linger on a warm Boston breeze, so too does the memory of that unimaginable day. It stands not merely as a historical oddity, but as a profound testament to the delicate balance between progress and precaution, between human ambition and the often unseen vulnerabilities that lie beneath our grandest designs. The Great Molasses Flood, with its tragic wave of syrup, reminds us that even the most commonplace substances can, under the wrong circumstances, unleash a force beyond comprehension. It whispers a timeless lesson from the cobblestone streets of Boston, that every structure we raise, every system we build, carries a human responsibility, and that vigilance, empathy, and unwavering commitment to safety are the true foundations upon which a just and resilient society must always stand. It is a story that refuses to be forgotten, clinging to the city's soul as tenaciously as molasses itself, ensuring that its sticky lesson will continue to sweeten our understanding of history for generations to come. Thank you for delving into this unusual chapter of history with us. If you found this journey captivating, please consider subscribing to Delight Show for more stories from the forgotten corners of our past. And perhaps, while you are here, why not explore another tale? We have many more waiting to be discovered.